Prosecutors filed 5 felony charges against Ryan Dodd: first-degree murder, home invasion, armed violence, residential burglary, and aggravated stalking. As we proceed through the case, you'll understand why that list matters. It tells a story of escalation, not a single impulsive act, but a sequence: entry, pursuit, weapon, fixation. Those charges frame how authorities want the case understood, not as a sudden loss of control, but as the end point of sustained behavior. Aggravated stalking sits alongside the homicide charge for a reason. It signals that what happened did not begin on the day of the killing. It began earlier, when one person stopped accepting reality as it was and started rewriting it to suit their own sense of entitlement. The victim was Ashley A. Stewart, 41 years old, a mother of 6 children. By January 2026, her marriage to Dodd was over. She had moved forward with her life. But according to prosecutors, that ending was not accepted. Separation did not register as final. Distance did not reduce involvement. Instead, they allege, fixation replaced closure. In stalking cases, the stalker begins authoring reality. Events are reframed, motives are reassigned. The victim's choices are no longer seen as autonomous, but as provocations or betrayals. Silence becomes rejection. Independence becomes defiance. Over time, perception overtakes fact, and the stalker responds not to the real person, but to a version of them that exists only inside the story he has constructed. On January 27, 2026, that internal narrative collided with real-world consequences. That morning, inside a home on Valentine Way in Oswego, Ashley Stewart's current husband reviewed home surveillance footage. What he saw was immediate and alarming. The video showed a man, believed by investigators to be Ryan Dodd, chasing Stewart into the garage. The urgency of the moment was unmistakable. Recognizing the danger, her husband called emergency services. Police arrived to find Ashley Stewart fatally wounded. An autopsy later confirmed she died from multiple sharp force injuries. The violence was direct and sustained. Within approximately 30 minutes of the attack, Ryan Dodd was arrested. He has remained in custody at the Kendall County Jail since then. The speed of that arrest did not undo what had already been set in motion. Prosecutors argue that the alleged forced entry into Stewart's home was not just a physical act, but a psychological one. It reflected a belief that her space was still accessible, that her life was still subject to his presence. That belief, authorities say, does not form in an instant. It forms when someone refuses to relinquish control over another person's choices. Stalking rarely looks dramatic at first. It often appears as persistence framed as concern, monitoring disguised as care, or repeated contact justified as unfinished business. Over time, these behaviors narrow the victim's sense of safety. The danger grows not because of one action, but because boundaries are consistently ignored. Law enforcement agencies have long identified stalking as one of the strongest predictors of intimate partner homicide. The escalation is usually visible. The challenge is that it is often misread as annoyance rather than threat until it is too late to intervene. In this case, aggravated stalking is not treated as a background detail. It is a central allegation. Prosecutors are arguing that fixation and control did not merely coexist with the violence, they drove it. Once someone believes they are entitled to define another person's reality, resistance can begin to feel to them like justification for force. Ryan Dodd has pleaded not guilty. The court process will determine legal responsibility, but the broader pattern is already clear. When perception replaces fact and control replaces consent, the risk of violence escalates rapidly. The impact of Ashley Stewart's death extends far beyond the charges on a court docket. She left behind 6 children. In the days following her death, a GoFundMe campaign was established to support her family. More than $55,000 was raised within a short period. The response reflected both grief and recognition, an understanding that the consequences of this crime will be carried for years by those who depended on her. As we move on to the next case, I'd really appreciate it if you could please take a moment to support my channel by liking this video and smashing the subscribe button. Thanks for the support. Second case. Investigators said Raman Kodakaram became aware of Zohreh Sadeghi through her podcast and through online audio discussion spaces used by members of the tech community, including Farsi language rooms where people talked about work opportunities. These spaces were open forums. Participation did not imply familiarity, friendship, or access. Listening did not create a relationship. For most people, that distinction is obvious. For Ramin, it was not. Zohreh Sadeghi was 33 years old. She was a podcaster whose work focused on the tech industry, career pathways, and professional opportunities, particularly for Farsi-speaking audiences. Her content was practical and informational. It was meant to reach people she would never meet, and for the overwhelming majority of listeners, that is exactly where the connection ended. But for Ramin, listening did not remain passive. According to police and court records, after encountering Sadeghi through her podcast and online audio rooms, he began reaching out to her directly. The contact was unwanted. It did not come from a shared personal history or mutual relationship. It came from fixation. When Sadeghi did not engage or limited her responses, the contact did not stop. It returned, again and again. Investigators later confirmed that Ramin contacted Sadeghi repeatedly over a period of months. At times, the volume was extreme. There were days when he called her dozens of times, and reports indicated that on at least one occasion the number exceeded 100 calls in a single day. The pattern was not random. It followed a cycle: contact, rejection, or silence, a pause, return. Each return tested whether the boundary had truly held. This pattern is central to understanding how stalking operates. It does not always escalate in a straight, dramatic line. More often, it advances through repetition. Each attempt that is not immediately stopped becomes data. Each pause becomes a recalibration. Each return moves slightly closer than the last. Zohreh Sadeghi did not misunderstand what was happening. She did not minimize it. She documented the behavior and sought help. She made it clear that the contact was unwanted. She did what victims are often advised to do. In early March 2023, just days before her death, Sadeghi and her husband, Mohammed Milad Nasseri, obtained a protection order against Ramin. The order legally prohibited him from contacting or approaching her. It was a formal recognition that the behavior had crossed into danger. But a protection order is a legal boundary, not a physical one. At the time the order was issued, authorities were unable to locate Ramin. He was a long-haul truck driver who traveled frequently for work and did not stay in one place. Because of that, the order had not yet been served. It existed on paper, but it had not yet been enforced in the real world. This gap matters. For someone engaged in boundary testing, the absence of immediate enforcement can be misread as permission. Silence becomes ambiguity. Delay becomes opportunity. The absence of consequence reinforces the belief that limits are negotiable. Investigators later said Ramin appeared to believe he had a personal connection to Sadeghi that did not exist. Family members and police accounts indicated that he interpreted public interaction and shared online spaces as something more intimate. Rejection did not register as final. It registered as temporary. This belief system is not uncommon in stalking cases. The stalker does not see no as an endpoint. It becomes a problem to work around. In the days leading up to the killings, Ramin traveled from Texas to Washington State. Police confirmed that he crossed state lines deliberately. This was not an impulsive act. It required planning, time, and sustained intent. The distance itself is part of the story. It shows commitment to the fixation, not a momentary loss of control. In the early morning hours of March 10, 2023, police were dispatched to a home in Redmond, Washington after reports of gunfire. When officers arrived, they found Mohammed Milad Nasseri outside the house with gunshot wounds. He died at the scene. Inside the home, officers found Zohreh Sadeghi dead. Ramin was also inside. He had died by suicide. Sadeghi's mother was in the home at the time of the attack. She managed to escape and call 911. Her survival was critical in helping investigators understand what happened inside the house. The violence itself happened quickly. The path to it did not. After the killings, investigators reconstructed the months that led up to that night. The repeated calls, the online contact, the protection order was filed only days earlier. Statements attributed to Ramin suggesting he would not stop contacting Sadeghi. None of this appeared suddenly in hindsight. It was visible while it was happening. Third case. December 14th, 2023. That morning in Broomfield, Colorado, Crystal Krug finished a routine familiar to countless parents, dropping her children at school, then drove back to the house she still shared with her husband. The marriage was ending. They slept in separate bedrooms. A divorce was being planned. What remained was proximity without partnership, a shared space stripped of shared consent. Crystal never made it safely back into her life. To understand how this day became inevitable, investigators would later rewind the clock to October 2023, when Crystal began receiving disturbing messages from someone claiming to be a former boyfriend from more than 20 years earlier, a man named Jack Anthony Holland. The messages were persistent and threatening. They referenced her movements, her schedule, and places she had recently been. The sender seemed to know where she was and when. The fear felt external. The danger appeared to come from outside her life. Crystal did what victims are urged to do. She documented the messages. She reported the harassment. She told others she was afraid. At first, law enforcement treated the situation as stalking by an old acquaintance who had resurfaced unexpectedly. But that story was false. Investigators would later determine that Daniel Krug, Crystal's husband, was the architect of the stalking. He had impersonated the ex-boyfriend using fake email accounts and burner phones. He sent threatening messages not only to Crystal, but also to himself, manufacturing the appearance of a shared external enemy. This design mattered. By inventing a threat that targeted them both, Daniel positioned himself as protector while secretly acting as the source of fear. He sent Crystal photographs of himself at work to suggest that both of them were being watched. He included precise details, such as her presence at a dentist's office, to heighten her paranoia and reinforce the illusion that someone else was tracking her movements. All of this occurred while they were still living under the same roof. That proximity sharpened the manipulation. Daniel could see Crystal's reactions in real time. He could measure how the fear changed her behavior. He could remain central in her emotional world without her consent, all while appearing supportive. This is where entitlement takes shape. Access becomes expectation. Expectation becomes ownership. And ownership does not accept rejection. Digital forensic evidence would later dismantle the fiction piece by piece. Investigators traced the harassment to the IP address of Daniel Krug's workplace, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Location data showed that the burner phone used in the stalking moved consistently with Daniel's personal phone. The man being impersonated, the real ex-boyfriend, was confirmed to be uninvolved and living in another state. There was no outside stalker. The danger was inside the home. The night before the killing, Daniel Krug's internet search history revealed preparation rather than panic. He searched for phrases including, "How much head trauma do you need to cause to knock someone unconscious?" and "When is a head injury a cause for concern?" The searches were time-stamped, they were specific, and they would later be presented at trial as evidence of planning. Then came the morning of December 14th. After Crystal returned from the school drop-off, she was attacked in the garage of the home she still shared with her husband. Forensic findings later established severe blunt force trauma to the head and a stab wound to the heart. The injuries were fatal. After the attack, Daniel Krug contacted police and requested a welfare check, presenting himself as a worried spouse. Officers responding to the call discovered Crystal's body. What initially appeared to be a sudden tragedy quickly transformed into a focused investigation shaped by the digital trail Daniel himself had created. At trial, the defense emphasized what was not found. They pointed to the absence of Daniel's DNA at the scene. They highlighted his behavior shortly after the crime, including stopping to buy a latte, arguing that his actions appeared calm and ordinary. Prosecutors did not deny those facts. They reframed them. This case, they argued, was not built on a chaotic struggle or stray physical traces. It was built on pattern, preparation, and proof that does not wash away. Jurors were shown the impersonation timeline, IP address tracing, burner phone correlation, and the search history conducted just hours before the killing. The stalking was not background context, it was preparation. The narrative presented to the jury was clear. Daniel Krug constructed a false external threat to destabilize Crystal emotionally while maintaining his central role in her life. When manipulation failed to restore control on his terms, violence followed. After a multi-week trial, a Broomfield jury returned its verdict in April 2025. Daniel Krug was convicted of first-degree murder, 2 counts of stalking, and criminal impersonation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 9.5 years for the stalking and impersonation convictions. Jurors later described the digital evidence as conclusive and damning. The sentence reflected more than the act of killing. It recognized that stalking, impersonation, and psychological manipulation were not side issues. They were the structure that made the crime possible. If you're a fan of true crime videos, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I've got lots of interesting videos coming up. Thank you. The fourth case. Rebecca Schaeffer had gained national recognition in the mid-1980s through her role on the CBS sitcom My Sister Sam. As her visibility increased, so did fan correspondence. Letters arrived regularly, most supportive, some personal. Among those writers was Robert John Bardo, who began sending repeated messages expressing emotional attachment. At the time, this behavior was not treated as exceptional. Fan devotion was normalized. Persistence was softened into enthusiasm. This early misreading mattered. It shaped how warning signs were understood, categorized, and ultimately dismissed. Rebecca was in her early 20s, navigating the ordinary pressures of a young acting career. Fan mail was part of the landscape. Studios, agents, and networks were accustomed to it. There was no legal framework that distinguished admiration from fixation, no shared language that identified repeated, unwanted contact as a developing threat. What existed instead was a cultural script that framed persistence as sincerity and emotional intensity as harmless dedication. Robert John Bardo's attachment did not remain distant. In 1987, he traveled to Los Angeles with the intention of seeing Rebecca in person. On 2 separate occasions, he attempted to gain access to the My Sister Sam set. Both times, studio security intervened and turned him away. The encounters were recorded, but they did not trigger further concern. He was not violent. He had not made explicit threats. He was classified as an overly enthusiastic fan rather than a risk. The pattern did not end there. It recalibrated. After returning home, Bardo continued writing letters. Over time, their tone reflected a belief that he shared a personal bond with someone he had never met. When Rebecca appeared briefly in a film scene that conflicted with his idealized image of her, the attachment shifted. Admiration curdled into grievance. What he perceived was not professional choice but personal betrayal. Still, there was no intervention. There was no mechanism for it. By 1989, Bardo returned to California. This time, he hired a private investigator to obtain Rebecca's home address. Under California law at the time, private investigators could legally access Department of Motor Vehicles records, including residential addresses, without the subject's consent or knowledge. Personal location data was treated as administrative information, not as a matter of safety. This procedural gap would prove fatal. On the morning of July 18, 1989, Rebecca was at home in her West Hollywood apartment. She was waiting for a script scheduled to be delivered that day, material connected to an audition for The Godfather Part 3. It was a small professional step, but an important one. Her career was moving forward, beyond television, toward more serious film opportunities. Nothing about the morning felt dangerous. It was routine, forward-looking. Bardo arrived at her apartment and knocked on the door. When Rebecca answered, he handed her a letter. The interaction was brief and calm. There was no confrontation, no raised voice. She thanked him and closed the door, returning inside to continue her day, still waiting for the script that had not yet arrived. Minutes later, he knocked again. This time, he was armed. Rebecca was shot at the doorway of her home. Emergency services were called, and she was transported to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead later that day. She was 21 years old. Only after the murder did the earlier behaviors receive language that could no longer be softened or dismissed. The letters, the travel, the attempts to access her workplace, the legal acquisition of her address. Each action, viewed in isolation, had been minimized. Together, they formed a trajectory that ended in violence. Bardo was arrested the following day. During legal proceedings, his defense argued that he suffered from schizophrenia and that his mental illness impaired his judgment. Psychiatric testimony was considered, but the court ruled that his condition did not preclude premeditation. The planning, the travel, the retrieval of the address, the return to the door after the initial encounter demonstrated intent. The case proceeded as a bench trial, not a jury trial, after prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. The judge convicted Bardo of first-degree murder with special circumstances, specifically lying in wait, reflecting the calculated nature of the act. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of early 2026, Robert John Bardo remains incarcerated at Avenel State Prison in California. The fifth case. Stalking rarely announces itself as danger at first. It often appears as persistence framed as concern, or monitoring disguised as care. In Ailen's case, reporting shows a former partner who remained oriented toward her daily life despite the relationship having ended. This kind of behavior does not require physical proximity to exert pressure. Knowing where someone studies, where they park, or what time they arrive becomes a substitute for real connection. Watching replaces relating. Ailen Martinez was 20 years old, a cosmetology student enrolled at the Aveda Institute in Davie, Florida. She was working toward a career that represented independence, creativity, and stability. Her days followed a familiar rhythm: classes, training, plans that pointed forward. In the fall of 2025, a romantic relationship in her life ended. For Ailen, the breakup meant distance and closure. For her former partner, Jose Orpi, it did not. According to family statements later shared with the media, contact continued after the relationship ended. This was not framed by her family as misunderstanding or emotional confusion. They explicitly described it as stalking. That distinction is critical. Stalking is defined not by one act, but by repetition, attention that continues after rejection, and presence that persists without consent. In Ailen's case, family members made clear that Orpi did not disengage when the relationship ended. Instead, he continued to reach out, maintaining focus on her life even as she tried to move on. This is how stalking often operates. It does not rely on confrontation. It relies on orientation. The person doing the stalking organizes their behavior around the movements, routines, and availability of someone else. Knowing where someone studies when they arrive or where they park can feel like connection to the person watching. In reality, it is surveillance. There is no shared agreement, no mutual exchange, only one-sided monitoring filling the space where a relationship used to exist. On Tuesday, January 27, 2026, Ailen Martinez arrived at the Aveda Institute campus in Davie, Florida. It was a place she knew well and visited regularly, tied directly to her education and plans. That familiarity became a point of access. According to police, Jose Orpi confronted her in the parking lot outside the institute. During that encounter, he shot her. Emergency responders were dispatched immediately. Law enforcement secured the scene, and 2 nearby schools were placed on lockdown as a precaution, while officers worked to ensure there was no further threat. Ailen Martinez died from her injuries at the scene. After shooting her, Orpi turned the gun on himself. He was transported to a hospital, where he later died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Authorities classified the incident as a murder-suicide. The violence occurred in a matter of moments. The conditions that led to it developed over a much longer period. In cases involving stalking and former intimate partners, the final act is often described as sudden only because the preceding behavior is minimized or misunderstood. Continued contact after a breakup is frequently dismissed as emotional difficulty or inability to let go. But research and law enforcement analysis consistently show that this period after separation is one of the most dangerous times for victims. In Ailen's case, there has been no public indication of a spontaneous argument or an unexpected escalation that day. What has been confirmed is the broader pattern: a former partner, continued contact after the relationship ended in the fall of 2025, and a fatal confrontation at a predictable location connected to Ailen's daily routine. This aligns closely with established patterns in stalking-related homicides, where familiarity and routine create opportunity. Family members of Ailen Martinez spoke publicly after her death, condemning the violence and the stalking that preceded it. Their statements removed ambiguity about how they understood what happened. This was not viewed as an isolated incident or an unforeseeable act. It was seen as the outcome of behavior that had already crossed boundaries long before January 27th. The aftermath extended beyond Ailen's immediate family. The Aveda Institute community mourned the loss of a student whose life ended in a space meant for learning and growth. Vigils were held. A community fundraiser was established to help support her family with funeral expenses. Lockdowns were lifted and daily routines resumed, but the sense of safety associated with ordinary places, parking lots, campuses, familiar schedules was permanently altered. The 6th case. Knoxville, Tennessee, is a mid-sized southern city where neighborhoods are quiet at night and homes sit close enough that people recognize familiar cars. On the morning of November 21, 2016, One of those homes became the center of a crime that would permanently alter how stalking was discussed in the community and far beyond it. Inside the house, Emma Walker, 16 years old, was asleep in her bedroom. She lived there with her mother and stepfather, attended Central High School, and was known among friends as social, energetic, and independent. Like many teenagers, she was navigating school, friendships, and the end of a relationship she had recently decided was over. That decision mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Emma had been dating William Riley Gall, an 18-year-old who had recently enrolled at Maryville College after graduating high school. The relationship had lasted about 2 years. By the fall of 2016, Emma ended it. Friends later said the breakup was clear and intentional. There was no confusion about her wanting to move on. What followed was not reconciliation, but persistence. According to investigators and court records, Gall struggled to accept the end of the relationship. Text messages recovered later showed repeated attempts to contact Emma after the breakup. Prosecutors would argue that this behavior crossed from unwanted communication into stalking, defined not by a single act, but by a pattern of fixation and refusal to respect boundaries. Just before 4 a.m., a single gunshot cut through the quiet of the Knoxville neighborhood. The bullet was fired from outside the home, passing through the exterior wall of Emma's bedroom and striking her as she slept. There was no confrontation, no argument, no warning inside the house. Emma was found critically injured in her bed. Emergency responders arrived, but she was pronounced dead shortly afterward. She was 16 years old. From the outset, investigators recognized that this was not a random act. The angle of the shot, the timing, and the location suggested intent and familiarity. Someone knew which room Emma slept in. Someone knew when the house would be quiet. The investigation immediately focused on individuals who had both access and motive. Attention quickly turned to Gall. Police determined that he had borrowed a rifle from his father without permission shortly before the shooting. Evidence showed he had been near the home during the early morning hours. Text messages, phone records, and surveillance footage were gathered and analyzed. When questioned, Gall gave inconsistent statements that raised further concern. Later that same day, Gall was arrested. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree premeditated murder, along with stalking, tampering with evidence, reckless endangerment, theft, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a dangerous felony. The stalking charge was not symbolic. It reflected the state's position that Emma's murder was the culmination of behavior that had already become dangerous well before the gunshot was fired. During the trial in May 2018, jurors were presented with a detailed reconstruction of events leading up to the murder. Messages sent after the breakup showed repeated attempts to reinsert himself into Emma's life. Prosecutors argued that Gall interpreted Emma's rejection not as a final boundary, but as something temporary, something to be corrected. Witnesses testified about Emma's efforts to create distance. Investigators explained how digital evidence placed Gall near the home at the time of the shooting. Forensic testimony established the trajectory of the bullet and confirmed that the shot had been fired deliberately from outside the house. The prosecution's case centered on a simple argument. This was not an impulsive act. It was the endpoint of fixation. The defense challenged aspects of the evidence, but the timeline and digital record remained consistent. After deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and stalking. The court sentenced Gall to life in prison. Under Tennessee law, that sentence requires 51 years to be served before parole eligibility. The ruling acknowledged both the severity of the crime and the sustained behavior that preceded it. Seventh case. The motive came first, long before the violence. Richard Farley did not describe his actions as anger or revenge. He described them as grievance. In his own mind, rejection was not a personal choice made by another human being. It was an injustice committed against him. That belief shaped everything that followed. What began in 1984 as unwanted attention toward a coworker hardened into a fixed conviction that he had been humiliated, ignored, and wronged, and that this wrong demanded acknowledgement. Farley was an engineer at ESL Incorporated, a defense electronics company in Sunnyvale, California. The woman he fixated on, Laura Black, rejected his advances clearly and consistently. She told him she was not interested. She asked him to stop contacting her. Farley did not misinterpret these refusals. He rejected them. In his internal narrative, her lack of interest became proof that she was mistreating him. Over time, his thinking narrowed. Rejection turned into grievance. Distance turned into perceived cruelty. Farley began to believe that Black owed him remorse, acknowledgement, or apology, not because of anything she had done, but because of how her refusal made him feel. This belief is critical to understanding the case. The violence did not emerge from confusion or heartbreak. It emerged from entitlement paired with fixation. The behavior escalated gradually but persistently. Farley left notes and gifts despite being told to stop. He made repeated phone calls. He monitored Black's presence at work. When she avoided him, he reframed her actions as hostility. When she sought protection, he interpreted it as persecution. He began filing grievances within the company, portraying himself as the victim of workplace bias and mistreatment. None of this occurred in secrecy. Management at ESL was aware of the situation. Meetings were held. Farley was instructed to attend counseling. The company attempted to manage the problem as an internal personnel issue, assuming that intervention, mediation, or time would resolve it. Each response was procedural. Each assumed that Farley's behavior could be corrected rather than confronted. This is where institutional delay took shape. No single person ignored the warning signs. Instead, responsibility fragmented. The conduct was recognized as inappropriate, but not urgent. It was troubling, but not framed as dangerous. Black continued working under pressure, altering routines, documenting behavior, and seeking help while systems moved carefully, step by step. The risk was acknowledged, but always just short of decisive action. By early 1988, Black turned to the legal system for protection. On February 2, 1988, she obtained a temporary restraining order against Farley. A court hearing was scheduled for February 17, 1988, to determine whether that order would be made permanent. From an institutional perspective, the process was functioning as designed. From Farley's perspective, it represented a final rejection, one that confirmed his belief that he was being publicly humiliated. What happened next was not impulsive. On February 16, 1988, one day before the restraining order hearing, Farley returned to his workplace armed for mass violence. He brought an arsenal, a shotgun, a rifle, several handguns, and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. This was not the preparation of someone acting on sudden despair. It was the preparation of someone who had planned, equipped, and resolved himself to act. Inside the ESL facility, Farley opened fire. Employees were shot as they worked, moved through hallways, or attempted to escape. The violence spread rapidly through the building. 7 people were killed. 4 others were wounded, including Laura Black, who survived after being shot. The attack ended only after a prolonged standoff with police, when Farley was taken into custody. The shooting lasted minutes. The motive had been forming for nearly 4 years. At trial, Farley offered a justification that stood in stark contrast to the evidence. He claimed he never intended to kill anyone. He said his plan was to commit suicide in front of Black in order to make her sorry. Prosecutors dismantled this claim with methodical precision. The number of weapons, the volume of ammunition, the movement through the building, and the number of victims demonstrated extensive premeditation. This was not a suicide attempt that escalated. It was a grievance-driven attack carried out with intent. Farley was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of attempted murder and assault. He was sentenced to death. The case became one of the most frequently cited examples in research on workplace violence, stalking escalation, and grievance-based attacks. Behavioral analysts, law enforcement agencies, and policymakers pointed to the Sunnyvale shooting as a clear demonstration of how fixation, when left unchecked, can evolve into mass violence. The 8 case. Christine Belford arrived at the New Castle County Courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware, on the morning of February 11, 2013, because the law required her to be there. Like so many days before it, this one revolved around custody hearings, filings, and the continued legal aftermath of a marriage that had ended years earlier. Belford was a mother of 3, and her life had become shaped by the court calendar. What appeared routine from the outside carried a weight that had been building for years. That morning would become one of the most consequential examples in U.S. history of how stalking tied to custody disputes can lead to fatal violence. The conflict between Christine Belford and her ex-husband, David Matusiewicz, did not fade after their separation. Instead, it hardened into a prolonged legal struggle centered on their children. In 2007, David Matusiewicz abducted the couple's 3 children and fled the United States. The case drew international attention when authorities confirmed he had taken them to Nicaragua. For nearly 2 years, Belford did not know where her children were or whether they were safe. In 2009, David Matusiewicz was apprehended and the children were returned to their mother. The recovery of the children brought relief, but it did not bring peace. The legal consequences of the kidnapping did not end the hostility. Custody litigation continued, keeping Belford and the Matusiewicz family bound together through court orders, hearings, and mandatory appearances. This forced proximity mattered. Each legal requirement ensured that separation existed only on paper. Belford's daily life was repeatedly interrupted by filings and court dates that reopened conflict rather than resolving it. Over time, this environment narrowed her world. Social routines became harder to maintain. Energy went into preparation and compliance instead of recovery. Federal investigators later established that the dispute evolved into sustained harassment. Authorities proved that multiple members of the Matusiewicz family engaged in coordinated stalking activity directed at Belford. This conduct included cyberstalking, repeated false accusations of child abuse, physical surveillance, and legal maneuvers designed to intimidate and destabilize her. The behavior was not isolated or spontaneous. Prosecutors demonstrated that it was intentional, organized, and continuous. The effect was cumulative pressure rather than a single threat. On February 11, 2013, Belford arrived at the New Castle County Courthouse for a scheduled family court matter related to child support. She was accompanied by her close friend, Laura Beth Mulford, who had come to offer support. Inside the building that morning, David Matusiewicz had also passed through security for his own hearing. The courthouse lobby was busy with attorneys, court employees, and other families navigating the legal system. It was an open, public space intended to represent order and safety. Waiting inside the courthouse was Thomas Matusiewicz, the father of David Matusiewicz. Investigators later confirmed that he had planned the attack. In the lobby, Thomas Matusiewicz approached and opened fire, fatally shooting Christine Belford and Laura Mulford. The violence was sudden and targeted. Bystanders had little time to react before law enforcement responded. Thomas Matusiewicz fled the immediate area and was later found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The killing shocked Wilmington and the wider legal community. A courthouse meant to resolve disputes had become the site of a double homicide. The presence of Belford's ex-husband inside the building at the time of the shooting highlighted the unavoidable nature of the encounter. Belford had no option to avoid that space. Court orders required her attendance. That lack of choice became central to how prosecutors later framed the danger she faced. The aftermath revealed that the pressure did not stop with Belford's death. Within days of the shooting, David Matusiewicz's sister, Amy Gonzalez, filed legal paperwork seeking custody of the children. Federal prosecutors cited this action as evidence that the fixation on control continued even after the violence. It reinforced the argument that the harassment was systemic rather than emotional, and that the family's conduct did not end with the loss of life. The federal case that followed broke new legal ground. Prosecutors charged David Matusiewicz, his mother Lenore Matusiewicz, and his sister Amy Gonzalez under federal stalking statutes. None of them physically carried out the shooting. Still, the government argued that their coordinated conduct directly contributed to the conditions that made the killings possible. A jury agreed. All 3 were convicted of federal stalking, resulting in death and sentenced to life in prison. This outcome marked the first time in U.S. history that federal stalking laws were used to hold family members criminally responsible for a death they did not physically commit. The court recognized that sustained harassment, intimidation, and surveillance can be lethal even without direct physical action. The ruling established a precedent that stalking is not merely preparatory behavior, but can function as a mechanism of violence itself. Ninth case. Surveillance footage became central to the investigation. Police confirmed that video showed Bruce Wayne Gerard forcing his way into Tanisha Richards' condominium, then leaving the residence just minutes later. The footage established timing, proximity, and movement. It placed him inside her home at the critical moment and documented his departure shortly afterward. There was no indication of a prolonged stay. The sequence suggested a rapid escalation from entry to exit. That brief window of time became the foundation upon which the case was built. It did not depict confusion or hesitation. It showed a compressed sequence of events that aligned with the moment Tanisha Richards' life ended. For investigators, the footage narrowed the question from what happened to how long it had been forming. When Houston police officers arrived at the Idlewood complex in the Westchase area on July 2, 2024, they discovered Tanisha Richards inside her condominium suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. She was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 25 years old. The location of the killing immediately shaped the investigation. This was not a public confrontation or a chance encounter. Entry into her home required intent, access, and effort. As detectives began reconstructing the events surrounding her death, earlier documentation took on renewed importance. In December 2023, nearly 7 months before the killing, Tanisha Richards had filed a police report. In that report, she named Bruce Wayne Gerard and described a pattern of escalating threats. According to police records, she documented dozens of threatening messages and expressed a specific fear that Gerard would eventually locate her current address. That report did not describe a single incident. It described persistence. It reflected concern rooted in repetition rather than speculation. At the time, the report existed within a familiar and difficult category of criminal behavior, stalking, that had not yet crossed into physical violence. The danger was recorded, but it remained potential rather than immediate. From December 2023 into mid-2024, the case entered a long, quiet phase. There were no public alerts, no visible emergency. Yet investigators would later confirm that surveillance footage showed Gerard in the area of Richards' residence before her death. Those movements did not stand out in real time. Like many stalking cases, their significance only became clear after violence occurred. Time, in this case, did not accelerate evenly. It compressed. On July 2, 2024, that compression ended. Richards was killed inside her home. The surveillance footage provided investigators with a narrow, defined window. Gerard's forced entry and rapid exit suggested an act carried out quickly and deliberately rather than a prolonged confrontation. 3 days later, on July 5, 2024, Gerard was arrested. He was 43 years old at the time. He was charged with capital murder and held without bond. Prosecutors cited the evidence gathered in the early days of the investigation as sufficient to pursue the most serious homicide charge under Texas law. Following his arrest, investigators searched Gerard's vehicle. Inside, they recovered a handwritten notebook. According to police and prosecutors, the notebook outlined a written plan to locate Tanisha Richards. The notes referenced specific tools, including the use of her social security number and phone records to track her whereabouts. The notebook altered the structure of the case. It provided evidence of preparation rather than spontaneity. It showed that locating Richards was not incidental. It was a defined objective that had been thought through and written down. For investigators, this evidence connected the December 2023 stalking report directly to the July 2024 killing. The fear Richards documented months earlier was no longer abstract. It aligned precisely with the methods described in the notebook. Her concern that Gerard would find her address was consistent with the tracking strategies investigators say he recorded. Court records further revealed that Gerard was on parole at the time of the killing, stemming from a 2005 aggravated assault conviction. This background became part of the prosecutorial context as the case moved forward. As 2024 transitioned into 2025, the case entered a slower procedural phase. Prosecutors and defense attorneys began reviewing extensive evidence, including surveillance logs, digital records, and the handwritten notebook recovered from Gerard's vehicle. In Texas capital cases, this stage is often prolonged. Because capital murder carries the possibility of the death penalty or life without parole, pretrial litigation typically extends 18 to 24 months. Motions addressing evidence admissibility, forensic review, and constitutional issues are standard. This period can feel static to the public, but it represents intense legal activity behind the scenes. Each piece of evidence is scrutinized. Each procedural step is contested. The same compression that defined the violence gives way to deliberate slowness in the courtroom. As of February 2026, Bruce Wayne Gerard remains in custody. According to the Harris County District Clerk's records, he is being prosecuted in the 482nd State District Court. No trial date has been publicly set, consistent with the timeline of capital cases in Texas. As the legal process continues, we move on to the 10th case. After Alice's death, her family chose to speak publicly. They described the months leading up to the murder and the way Alice's fear had been real long before it was acted upon. They worked with advocacy groups and policymakers to explain how stalking often operates through accumulation rather than single incidents. Their work led to the creation of the Alice Ruggles Trust, which focuses on education, awareness, and improving responses to stalking. Alice Ruggles was 24 years old. She lived in Gateshead in the north of England. She had ended a relationship that no longer felt safe. What followed was not a sudden act of violence, but a sustained pattern of behavior that specialists, prosecutors, and her family later described as stalking in its clearest and most dangerous form. Alice Ruggles met Tremont Dillon while working abroad. In the early stages, the relationship appeared intense rather than alarming. Contact was frequent, attention felt constant. Over time, that intensity became controlling. Alice later told people close to her that the relationship left her feeling overwhelmed and fearful. When she ended it and returned to the UK, she believed physical distance would bring safety. It did not. After the breakup, Dillon refused to accept separation. He continued contacting Alice persistently. He hacked her social media accounts and monitored her online activity. He made repeated, uninvited journeys of more than 120 miles to reach her home. He left unwanted gifts. None of these acts happened once. They happened repeatedly. Each action reinforced the same message. The relationship was not over in his mind. Alice told friends she felt watched. She described fear that was difficult to explain through a single incident, but impossible to dismiss when viewed as a whole. This is how stalking often operates, not through one dramatic confrontation, but through repetition that erodes safety and autonomy over time. Alice reported what was happening. She contacted police on more than one occasion. Her reports described ongoing behavior, not isolated moments. She was not seeking reassurance. She was seeking protection. What she encountered instead was a fragmented response. According to later findings by the Independent Office for Police Conduct, Northumbria Police did not investigate her complaints as stalking. Instead, they were categorized as lower-level harassment. This meant the behavior was assessed in pieces rather than as a pattern. Dillon was issued a police information notice, PIN, a formal warning used at the time to inform someone that their behavior could constitute harassment or stalking and that further contact could lead to arrest. The notice acknowledged concern. It did not stop the behavior. Dillon continued attempting contact after the warning was issued. At the same time, his conduct had raised concern within the military. Dillon was serving in the British Army and was based at Glencorse Barracks. His superiors warned him to stay away from Alice. This detail matters. Both civilian police and military authorities had identified his behavior as inappropriate and escalating. Yet no coordinated response treated the conduct as an ongoing threat requiring decisive intervention. On 7 October 2016, Alice reported a further breach of the warning. This report came just 5 days before she was killed. According to official guidance, decisions about arrest and escalation should be made by police officers based on risk assessment. In Alice's case, she was asked whether she wanted Dillon arrested. That question placed responsibility onto the person already living in fear rather than addressing the behavior itself. On the 12th of October 2016, Alice was at home in her flat in Gateshead. Dillon entered the property. She was attacked in her bathroom and fatally stabbed. She was 24 years old. The murder was not the result of a sudden argument that day. It was not triggered by a single confrontation. In court, prosecutors described the killing as the endpoint of fixation and control that had been building for months. The violence followed certainty that had already formed internally. By the time the final act occurred, the decision had long since been made. In 2017, Dillon was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years before parole eligibility. The court recognized the significance of the stalking behavior that preceded the killing and treated it as central to understanding how the crime occurred. The conviction answered the question of responsibility, but it did not resolve the wider issue of prevention. Alice had done what victims are often told to do. She documented behavior. She reported concerns. She trusted that warning systems would reduce risk. Her family later emphasized that the failure was not a lack of information, but how that information was interpreted and acted upon. Through their advocacy, Alice's family highlighted a critical truth. Stalking is defined by accumulation. Risk does not always announce itself with a single dramatic event. It builds through repetition. When behavior is treated as disconnected, danger can be underestimated until it is too late. The 11th case. Brighton, England is where this story begins. A coastal city known for busy streets, close-packed neighborhoods, and homes that sit side by side. It was here that Shana Grice, a 19-year-old woman, tried to live an ordinary life after ending contact with a man who refused to accept that decision. What happened next was not sudden. It happened slowly, through repeated warnings that were documented, acknowledged, and ultimately left unresolved. Shana Grice lived in Brighton during a period of her life when independence should have been expanding. She had made a clear choice to cut off communication with Michael Lane, a man who became fixated after she rejected him. That boundary, clear to her, was not accepted by him. Instead of withdrawing, Lane began to impose himself on her daily life. He appeared outside her home without invitation. He remained nearby for long stretches of time. He watched. This was not chance. It was persistence. Shana recognized the behavior as threatening. She did not minimize it, and she did not keep it to herself. In July 2015, she contacted Sussex police to report that Lane was repeatedly turning up at her address and monitoring her movements. Officers attended and recorded her complaint. The situation, however, was assessed as low risk. No immediate protective action followed. No restraining order was pursued. The behavior was treated as something that might fade on its own. It did not. The unwanted presence continued. Shana contacted police again. The reports followed a consistent pattern. The same individual, the same location, the same fear. Each report added another entry to the record, yet the official response remained static, even as the behavior did not. In October 2015, a decision was made that would later become central to the case. Shana was issued a £90 fixed penalty notice for wasting police time. This occurred after officers concluded she had not initially disclosed the prior personal nature of her relationship with Lane. At the time, the fine reframed her repeated fear as inconvenience. It placed scrutiny on her reporting rather than on his behavior. Later reviews would describe this as a serious failure in judgment. The impact of that fine was immediate. It discouraged further reporting and altered the dynamic between victim and authority. Years later, one of the officers involved, Trevor Godfrey, would be found guilty of misconduct for issuing the notice, but at the moment it was given, the effect was silencing. Despite this, the situation around Shana did not ease. Lane's fixation continued. His presence remained a constant pressure in her daily life. Shana adapted in ways common to stalking victims. She altered routines. She stayed alert. These changes are often mistaken for stability, but they are signs of someone navigating ongoing threat. Another critical warning emerged involving access to her home. There were concerns that Lane had obtained a key to Shana's address. This represented a significant escalation from watching to potential entry. The report was not properly investigated. After Shana's death, P.C. John Barry Mills was found guilty of gross misconduct for failing to adequately investigate this key-related incident. At the time, however, the risk was not fully addressed. By 2016, no protective framework was in place. There was no restraining order, no sustained reassessment of risk, no coordinated response recognizing that the behavior formed part of a dangerous pattern. What appeared unchanged on paper was, in reality, becoming more dangerous. On the evening of 25 August 2016 in Brighton, Shana Grice was murdered at her home. She had been stabbed multiple times. Emergency services were alerted after a fire was reported at the address. Michael Lane was arrested shortly afterward. The violence itself was swift. The path leading to it had taken more than a year. Lane admitted to stalking Shana but denied murder. In March 2017, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The court heard how his fixation intensified after rejection and how his actions followed a sustained pattern rather than a spontaneous outburst. After the criminal case, attention shifted to what had happened before Shana's death. Independent reviews examined Sussex Police's handling of her reports. The findings were clear. Her case should have been classified as high risk. The decision to fine her for wasting police time was criticized as harmful. Repeated opportunities to intervene had been missed. Disciplinary proceedings followed. 2 officers faced formal consequences. PC John Barry Mills was found guilty of gross misconduct for failing to investigate the report concerning the key to Shana's home. Trevor Godfrey was found guilty of misconduct for issuing the fixed penalty notice. These outcomes confirmed that the failures were not abstract or unavoidable. They were the result of specific decisions. As the reviews continued, further context emerged. Investigators confirmed that Michael Lane had previously been reported by at least 13 other women for stalking-related behavior. The reports described similar patterns: fixation, persistent unwanted contact, monitoring, and refusal to accept rejection. None of those earlier complaints resulted in sustained intervention that stopped the behavior. Shana was not encountering an isolated offender. She was encountering a repeated pattern that had already been documented across multiple victims. The case led to wider consequences. Following public criticism and formal reviews, Sussex police announced that victims of domestic abuse and stalking would no longer be fined for wasting police time. Other police forces across England and Wales later followed. The policy shift acknowledged a central failure exposed by the case. Penalizing victims for imperfect reporting discourages disclosure and increases risk. 12th case, June 18, 2021. That was the day Gracie Spinks, age 23, went to Blue Lodge Farm stables in Duckmanton, Derbyshire, to care for her horse, Paddy. It was part of her routine, a place she knew, a space associated with calm, responsibility, and familiarity. She had been there many times before, with no reason to expect danger. She did not leave the stables alive. Gracie was stabbed to death while tending to her horse. Nearby, Michael Sellers, a former colleague, was later found dead, having taken his own life. The violence itself unfolded quickly. What followed did not. To understand how this moment came to exist, the story must move backward, not to uncover a mystery, but to trace a sequence that had already been written. Gracie had previously worked at a company where Sellers held a supervisory role. When she left the job, their professional contact should have ended. It did not. Sellers continued to message her. He appeared unexpectedly. His attention became intrusive and unwelcome. There was no single dramatic confrontation, no sudden explosion of behavior that clearly demanded emergency intervention. Instead, there was persistence, repetition, a refusal to accept distance. This is how stalking often presents itself, not as a single alarming act, but as a pattern that feels wrong before it looks dangerous. By February 2021, Gracie decided to act. She contacted Derbyshire police and reported Sellers for stalking and harassment. During the call, she described feeling uncomfortable and unsettled by his behavior. She did not frame the situation as a crisis. She framed it as concern. She did what public guidance tells people to do: report early before harm occurs. Police spoke to Sellers. He was given what officers later described as words of advice. No arrest was made. No charge followed. The report was assessed and classified as low risk. The case was closed. On paper, the situation was considered resolved. In reality, the underlying behavior had not been interrupted, only reclassified. One of the challenges in assessing stalking is its uneven rhythm. Some pauses appear reassuring, periods of silence that seem to validate the idea that intervention worked or that fear was overstated. From an administrative perspective, these gaps can look like de-escalation. From the person experiencing it, they can feel like waiting, never knowing whether attention has ended or merely shifted. In May 2021, another warning emerged. A member of the public discovered a bag near the area around Blue Lodge Farm, close to the stables where Gracie regularly cared for her horse. Inside were items later linked to Sellers, including weapons. The bag was handed to police. It was logged as lost property. No link was made to the earlier stalking report. No investigative escalation occurred. 2 separate signals now existed within the system. They remained unconnected. Gracie was not informed that the bag had been found. She was not told that items connected to the man she had reported months earlier had appeared near a place she regularly visited. Each piece of information stayed within its own procedural boundary. Then came June 18, 2021. Gracie went to the stables as she normally did. There was no unusual deviation in her plans. She was not traveling through an unfamiliar area. She was not meeting someone new. She was carrying out a routine task in a familiar environment when Sellers approached her. The attack occurred there, at the stables, while she was caring for her horse. The ordinariness of the setting matters. It removes the idea of chance. Gracie was not caught in an exposed or risky situation. The violence intruded into a space that should have been safe. Following her death, an inquest examined not only the immediate events but the sequence that preceded them. The focus was not on sensational detail, but on process, how information was assessed, categorized, and acted upon. The inquest concluded that Gracie was unlawfully killed by Sellers. During proceedings, the assistant coroner gave clear and explicit legal direction to the jury. They were instructed that they could not conclude that police failings probably or even possibly caused Gracie's death. The legal threshold for causation was not met, and the verdict reflected that limitation. This distinction is essential. The inquest did not determine that institutional failures caused the murder, but it also did not dismiss those failures as inconsequential. Following the inquest, the coroner issued a prevention of future deaths report. This document shifted focus away from legal causation and toward systemic risk. It highlighted serious concerns about how stalking complaints were assessed, how information was siloed, and how opportunities to escalate safeguarding measures were missed. The report's purpose was not retrospective blame, it was prospective warning. The concern was whether similar handling of stalking reports and weapons discoveries, left unchanged, could place others in danger. The absence of legal causation did not negate the presence of institutional vulnerability. After Gracie's death, Derbyshire police acknowledged shortcomings in their handling of both the stalking report and the discovery of the weapons bag. Reviews were conducted. Training around stalking risk assessment was examined. Procedures were scrutinized, but reform does not undo consequence. 13th case. Clare Chick was a university lecturer. Teaching was not just her job. It shaped how she lived. She worked with students training for demanding professions, researching how people cope under pressure and how resilience is built when stress does not go away. In her professional life, she studied endurance. In her private life, she was being tested by a threat that also refused to fade. Clare Chick lived in Plymouth, England, where she lectured at the University of Plymouth. Colleagues later described her as committed, thoughtful, and deeply invested in her students' well-being. Outside the lecture hall, however, her life had become increasingly constrained. By 2024, she had separated from her husband, Paul Butler. The relationship had ended, but his presence did not. Separation did not bring distance. It triggered persistence. After the separation, contact continued in ways Clare did not want and did not invite. Messages arrived that ignored clear boundaries. Encounters felt intentional rather than coincidental. What she was experiencing was not confusion or mixed signals, but fixation. Over time, that fixation became harder to dismiss and impossible to ignore. Clare understood that this was not a temporary phase. It was a pattern. She reported it. More than once. Over the months leading up to her death, Clare made multiple formal reports to Devon and Cornwall police. These were not vague expressions of unease. She gave statements. She described the behavior. She explained how it was affecting her sense of safety. Each report added detail to the same picture. The harassment was ongoing, and it was escalating. There was no single incident that forced immediate action. Instead, there were repeated moments that could be minimized if viewed in isolation. A message that crossed a line. An appearance that felt intrusive. A sense of being watched. Each episode alone could be treated as limited. Together, they formed a trajectory that pointed in only one direction. This is how stalking often avoids decisive intervention. It advances through accumulation. By January 2025, Clare's fear had sharpened. In one of her final statements to police, she expressed concern for her life. She did not frame this as speculation. She described what was happening and what she believed it could lead to. The warning was explicit. The risk was named. On the evening of January 22, 2025, that risk became physical. Evidence later showed that Paul Butler went to a Sainsbury's supermarket that evening and purchased a pack of kitchen knives. This detail mattered in court because it showed preparation. The violence that followed was not formed in a moment. It was planned. Later that night, Clare was attacked outside her home in Plymouth. She was stabbed multiple times. Emergency services were called, and she was rushed to Derriford Hospital. Doctors worked to save her life, but her injuries were catastrophic. Clare was pronounced dead in the early hours of January 23, 2025. To someone encountering the case without context, the attack might appear sudden, but the timeline tells a different story. The violence was the final act of a sequence that had been unfolding for months, with warnings documented at every stage. Paul Butler was arrested shortly after the attack. The investigation progressed quickly because the evidence was clear: surveillance footage, witness accounts, the knife purchase, and the documented history of stalking all aligned. Butler later pleaded guilty to murder and possession of a bladed article. At Plymouth Crown Court, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years before he can be considered for parole. During sentencing, the court acknowledged the sustained harassment and fear Clare had lived with. This was not treated as a spontaneous outburst. It was recognized as the endpoint of persistent, escalating behavior. After Clare's death, Devon and Cornwall police launched an urgent review into how her reports had been handled. The case was referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, reflecting the seriousness of the concerns. These were not routine steps. They were acknowledgments that something had gone wrong. By January 2026, the scale of that failure became clearer. The IOPC served 18 misconduct notices to officers and staff from Devon and Cornwall Police in relation to their handling of Clare's case. The notices did not change the outcome of the trial, but they formally recognized that her repeated warnings were not addressed appropriately. It was an institutional admission that process had failed to interrupt a known pattern of risk. While these reviews unfolded, another part of Clare's life was also being formally recognized. In June 2025, the University of Plymouth awarded Clare a posthumous Ph.D. for her research into student nurse resilience. The work focused on how individuals endure sustained pressure and continue functioning under strain. Colleagues described her research as meaningful and relevant, particularly in professions where emotional load is constant. The 14th case. Control was the main motive. Joe Story did not kill Carrie Macauly in a moment of confusion or emotional collapse. He killed her because he could not accept separation, boundaries, or loss of dominance. When the relationship ended and legal barriers were put in place, his sense of entitlement did not recede. It intensified. The restraining order, the charges, and the growing distance did not remove his access psychologically. They threatened it, and that threat became the trigger. Carrie Macauly was 32 years old, a mother of 2 young boys, living in Norwich, England. She was attempting to step out of a relationship that had become dangerous. By late 2016, she had already reported violence. She had already sought help. The system had already acknowledged risk. What remained unresolved was Story's fixation on regaining control over a woman who was actively trying to live without him. Story's behavior followed a familiar trajectory. Early in the relationship, control appeared as monitoring and jealousy. He questioned Carrie's movements, reacted aggressively to perceived rejection, and attempted to dictate who she saw and how she lived. Over time, this hardened into intimidation and physical violence. Court proceedings later confirmed that this pattern did not begin with Carrie. Joe Story had a documented history of violent and controlling behavior toward multiple women before her. By 2016, the danger was no longer ambiguous. Carrie reported Story to police following an assault. A restraining order was put in place. He was charged with harassment and assault and released on bail. These were not informal warnings. They were legal acknowledgments that contact posed a risk. From Carrie's perspective, these measures were meant to create distance. From Story's perspective, they represented loss. That loss mattered. On January 8, 2017, Story went to Carrie Macauly's flat in Norwich in direct breach of the restraining order. The act of going there was not impulsive. It required a decision to ignore legal boundaries that had been clearly explained to him. Inside the flat, Carrie was subjected to a sustained and violent attack. She was beaten to death. There was no evidence of mutual violence or provocation. The attack was one-sided and deliberate. What followed became one of the most discussed elements of the case, not because of shock, but because of what it revealed about intent. After the assault, Story used his phone to take a selfie of himself with Carrie's blood visible on his face. Prosecutors emphasized that this occurred after the violence had ended. It was not taken during a struggle. It showed awareness, presence of mind, and emotional detachment. He then left the flat, leaving Carrie alive but fatally injured. This detail mattered because it contradicted any claim of loss of control. The pause required to take that image demonstrated consciousness and choice. In court, it was used not for reaction, but for clarity. Carrie was not discovered by chance. Concern grew when the father of her children could not contact her to arrange the return of their 2 sons. Alarmed, Carrie's mother and brother went to her flat. Inside, they found her gravely injured. Emergency services were called, but Carrie could not be saved. Story was arrested later that day. At trial, the prosecution did not need to build a case around speculation. The evidence showed continuity. Story's behavior toward Carrie matched his conduct in previous relationships: control, escalation, boundary violations, and violence when separation became real. The restraining order, instead of deterring him, marked the point at which his behavior accelerated. On June 15, 2017, Joe Story was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced later that month to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. The judge cited the severity of the violence, his history of abuse toward women, and the deliberate breach of court orders designed to protect the victim. In November 2017, Story attempted to appeal the sentence, arguing that it was too severe. The Court of Appeal dismissed the appeal, confirming that the minimum term accurately reflected the gravity of the crime and the risk he posed. After the conviction, a domestic homicide review examined how agencies had responded to Story's behavior before Carrie's death. The findings did not reveal hidden information. They revealed fragmentation. Police records, court orders, and prior reports each documented risk, but those signals were not fully connected or escalated across systems. Protective measures existed, but enforcement was fragile. Patterns were visible but treated as isolated events. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.